How to build fraud detection automation for fintech SMBs on Azure. Hey, welcome. In this video, we're breaking down how to build fraud detection automation for fintech SMBs on Azure. Let's get into it. Now, next up, why fintech SMBs need fraud detection automation now. Manual fraud review does not scale. A payments team reviewing flagged transactions by hand might catch obvious anomalies, but it misses velocity attacks, account takeover patterns, and cross-channel fraud that only shows up when you analyze data in motion. For a fintech startup processing a few thousand transactions a day, the gap between we check things manually and we have real-time monitoring is usually where a $50,000 fraud event hides. The regulatory pressure compounds this. The PCI-DSS version 4.0 standard, which took full effect in 2024, requires continuous monitoring of cardholder data environments, not periodic reviews. Anti-money laundering rules under FinCEN require suspicious activity reports within 30 days of detection. If your detection is manual and slow, you are exposed on both the loss side and the compliance side. The honest answer is that most fintech SMBs cannot afford a dedicated fraud data science team. But they can afford Azure, and that is enough to build something real. Let's talk about Azure services that power a complete fraud detection pipeline. When planning fraud detection automation for fintech SMBs, 5 Azure components form the core stack. Here is what each one does. You do not need Azure Synapse or Microsoft Fabric for real-time fraud detection. Those platforms are suited for batch analytics and historical ML training. For pattern-based payment fraud, the streaming tier is what matters. If you are integrating incoming payment events from Stripe or an open banking API, the Azure API Management for Fintech Startups, 5 Design Patterns post covers how to route and secure those events before they reach your Event Hub. Next up, setting up Azure Event Hubs for real-time transaction monitoring. Azure Event Hubs is the ingestion layer. Think of it as a high-throughput message bus that absorbs payment events from your payment processor, core banking system, or open banking API and holds them for downstream processing. Here is how to configure it. One practical note on Event Hubs versus Apache Kafka: Event Hubs supports the Kafka protocol natively, so you can point an existing Kafka producer at it without changing your application code. For SMBs that do not already run a Kafka cluster, Event Hubs is the simpler choice because Microsoft manages all the underlying infrastructure. Now, let's talk about configuring Azure Stream Analytics for fraud detection. Azure Stream Analytics is where the fraud detection logic actually executes. You write queries in a SQL dialect and they run continuously against your Event Hub stream, firing the moment a transaction matches a fraud pattern. Here is a basic velocity rule that flags any account making more than 5 transactions in 10 minutes. This query runs continuously. The moment an account crosses the threshold, the output goes to Cosmos DB and Logic Apps picks it up within seconds. Now, moving on to automating fraud alerts with Azure Logic Apps. Once Stream Analytics writes a fraud case to Cosmos DB, you need automated action. Azure Logic Apps handles the full alert and response workflow without requiring custom application code. A production fraud alert workflow looks like this. The same Logic Apps approach works well for broader compliance workflows beyond fraud. Our post on how to automate SMB compliance using Azure Logic Apps goes deeper on AML rule enforcement patterns that pair directly with this setup. Next up, now, rule-based versus AI-powered fraud detection on Azure. Rule-based fraud detection is what the pipeline above implements. You define explicit thresholds and conditions, and the system fires when they are met. It is deterministic, auditable, and fast to deploy. The limitation is that sophisticated fraudsters learn your rules and work around them. A velocity check set at 5 transactions per 10 minutes will not catch a fraudster running 4 per 10 minutes across multiple compromised accounts. AI-powered fraud detection uses machine learning models to score transaction risk based on behavioral patterns. Azure Machine Learning lets you train a model on labeled historical fraud data and deploy it as a real-time scoring endpoint. Azure Stream Analytics can call that endpoint via a user-defined function inside your query, scoring each transaction as it arrives. The honest trade-off: ML models require a meaningful volume of labeled fraud data to train effectively, typically at least 10,000 confirmed fraud samples. Most fintech SMBs processing under $50 million in annual payment volume will not have that from their own transaction history alone. The practical path is to start with rule-based detection, collect labeled outcomes over 6 to 12 months, and layer in ML-based scoring once you have enough training data. Microsoft's Azure AI Fraud Detection Reference Architecture covers the ML model deployment path in detail. Let's talk about moving on to PCI-DSS and GDPR compliance for Azure fraud detection. PCI-DSS compliance requires that cardholder data in your Event Hub stream is tokenized before ingestion. Do not publish raw primary account numbers to Event Hubs. Use your payment processor's tokenization instead. Stripe provides a token identifier per transaction and never exposes the raw card number in webhook payloads. Azure Event Hubs encrypts data at rest by default using Microsoft managed keys, and you can switch to customer managed keys for stricter compliance postures. GDPR requires that personal data in your fraud pipeline has a defined retention period and can be deleted on request. Set a TTL on Cosmos DB fraud case documents to 90 days unless your AML retention requirements mandate longer storage. For AML audit logs in blob storage, the EU GDPR Article 17 right to erasure applies to personal data, but AML record-keeping requirements take precedence when they conflict. Azure holds PCI-DSS Level 1 certification across its core services including Event Hubs, Stream Analytics, Cosmos DB, and Logic Apps. You inherit the infrastructure compliance. Application-level controls, such as tokenizing card numbers before publishing to Event Hubs and configuring role-based access controls, remain your responsibility. Let's talk about moving on to what it costs to build fraud detection automation on Azure. Here is a realistic cost estimate for an SMB processing around 500,000 transactions per month. Commercial fraud detection SaaS platforms like Count, Sardine, and Sift typically start at $1,500 to $5,000 per month for SMB tiers. Building fraud detection automation for fintech SMBs on Azure costs roughly 10x less at this transaction volume, and you own the pipeline entirely rather than renting access. Costs scale with transaction volume. At 5 million transactions per month, you would move to 2 or 3 streaming units in Stream Analytics and increase your Event Hubs throughput units accordingly. Even at that scale, the Azure build remains significantly cheaper than comparable SaaS alternatives. Next up, how long does implementation take? A small development team of 2 to 3 engineers can deliver a functional fraud detection pipeline in 4 weeks. This is a faster timeline than most SMBs expect. The pipeline can be in production catching real fraud before many enterprise procurement cycles even close. For fintech SMBs building out a broader payment automation architecture alongside this fraud detection layer, the Payment Automation on Azure, a fintech starter guide explains how fraud detection fits into a full payment orchestration stack. Let's talk about conclusion. Fraud detection automation for fintech SMBs on Azure is achievable without an enterprise budget or a dedicated data science team. The combination of Azure Event Hubs for ingestion, Azure Stream Analytics for real-time rule execution, and Azure Logic Apps for automated alerting produces a pipeline that processes transactions in under 500 milliseconds at a cost well under $200 per month for most SMB transaction volumes. Start with 5 to 7 rule-based fraud checks, measure your false positive rate over the first few weeks, and add ML-based scoring once you have enough labeled data to work with. The practical first step is mapping your current transaction data schema to an Event Hubs compatible event format. From there, the Stream Analytics queries and Logic Apps workflows follow a repeatable pattern. If you want help standing up this architecture for your fintech or community bank, get in touch with our team to talk through your specific setup.